Welcome back everyone to a new episode of Goober Games, the series where I look at games every goober likes to determine if they're actually good or not. I put out a poll for you guys to pick the game for this episode, and you guys chose 2018's least interactive video game, Detroit Become Human. I'm not gonna lie, I have played this game before, and when I saw the results of this poll, I was overcome with one specific emotion. Dread. Because after my first playthrough a few years back, I really didn't like it, but I did replay it with an open mind wanting to like it. To preface, a game like this is going to be hard to review with how many branching paths there are and all the different ways the story can go, so I tried my best to do what I could in these situations while also trying to make the game as narratively satisfying as possible, which also means trying my best to execute each character's goal. But with all that out of the way, let's see whether or not Detroit Become Human is worthy of the title of Goober Game. I want to start this review the same way that Detroit Become Human does, and that's with the start of Detroit Become Human. I know, I'm really breaking the mold here, but Detroit has one of the best openings I've ever seen in a video game and does so much legwork to establish this universe. We start off with Connor, an android in an elevator, playing with this quarter the way he does throughout the story. It's such a small detail, but shows so much, as he's doing something that seems near impossible and requires so much skill, showing how advanced and algorithmic he is as an android, but also manages to show some of the humanity that's already in him, as a robot should have no need to fidget with something to keep him from being bored, but Connor does. It honestly might be the time these androids feel the most human in this story. Same with saving the fish later, but to a lesser extent, as you could argue it's his empathy, and it probably is, but you could also argue he's just programmed to try and save both human and animal life when possible. It also doesn't help that saving the fish is completely optional, especially because it sets a precedent for the rest of the game, that being that I have to do the work myself to make these characters interesting. But then we see the mother freaking out about her daughter being held hostage and further panicking when she sees they sent an android to take care of the situation, setting up how some people in society feel about androids and the persecution they'll face later in the game. There's so many little details that are super informative about the universe, even when you see the stove and it says the family was about to have dinner, which shows all the meaningless but mandatory information that an android would have to pick up on and take note of. And what I really appreciate about this opening is how a lot of what you do seems small at the start but can have a huge impact. Like how you gather information about the android holding the girl hostage, which gives you an understanding of the conversational and observational mechanics of this game and their effects on the story, while also, in this case, setting up the android deviation plot from the very start. And despite how slow the game may seem at the start in its gameplay, it shows how important and consequential your actions can be in situations as tense as this and still manages to get your heart racing. This is truly one of the best first impressions I have ever gotten from a game. This opening is fast, high octane, informative, tactile, and doesn't even slow down a turn. And that is one of this game's many faults. Because have you ever seen what happens when a car doesn't slow down to turn? It's not pretty. And Detroit is no exception, because Markus and Kara's storylines are a car crash compared to Connor's section. You go from using your words to talk an android out of a hostage situation to shopping for paint and doing chores. And I understand why. You're doing these chores to make you hate the life androids are forced to live and want them to be free the same way you want to be free from doing the dishes. But like, come on, I'm doing a Roomba's job. And frankly, that's what androids were designed to do in this universe. They're the next step after Roombas, the same way Roombas are the next step after vacuums, which are the step after brooms. And I know, the androids are supposed to be more than that. They're supposed to have their own lives and sentience, but frankly, they don't, and believe me, we will get to that. But regardless of how you view the androids in this game, I cannot see how they thought the best way to introduce this gameplay is by having you do chores and do fighting game inputs to like open a door or pick up the trash. And that's if you can even call this gameplay. Even with the stupid motion controls and touchpad stuff, everything I'm doing on this controller to play the game can be done on a Bop It. Even when the story is presenting something super interesting, like playing as Markus looking for spare parts in the junkyard, a section highlighted by your lack of senses that match the characters, it's still ruined by making you slowly walk around looking for these parts with no clue as to where they are. Even Supermassive knew to add a sprint button in their first game with this style. It does have some highlights though, like pretty much all of Connor's sections, because the only way to make the robo skills interesting is through detective work. And I like how analysis helps you, like how you can get a gun in the opening, but even then it has its flaws. Like how sometimes during investigations, solutions reveal clues instead of the other way around. What especially irritated me though was how as Connor, you investigate what you just did as Markus, so you know exactly what happened already. I feel like they should have broken the linearity and approached it from Connor's perspective, and when you find evidence, you flash back to Markus and choose how the evidence came to be, influencing the context of how Connor sees it. It's just a pain to see all of their great ideas get ruined by this boring gameplay. Like how interrogating the androids to find the deviant is incredibly obvious, or how cool it is to play as all 3 characters in one mission at the same place, but that literally only happens one time. And I think the biggest lie this game sold people regarding the gameplay is how much choice you actually have. It's like the Telltale games where you can't actually make any decisions that make fundamental changes to the plot. The murderer android pleads with Connor to just let him go or tell the cops that he's not there, but you don't actually have that choice. He even says at one point, "Why couldn't you have just left me there?" Which is exactly what I wanted to do. Despite how badly I wanted Hank to like me, I couldn't listen to him and just stay in the car. Despite how much of a pacifist I was in Markus's revolution, I was still forced to ram a garbage truck into an Apple store. Even some of the flowcharts only lead to one outcome. I was so understanding of both humans and androids as Markus in my playthrough, which ended up having little to no consequences. And I realized this when Markus asked Kara this question.
You said you're with a little girl, right? You know that humans hate us. Why are you protecting her?
The Markus I played as would never ask that question. It is cool when one character story affects another, like how Kara killing Todd affects the public opinion on Jericho, but it just sucks how unimpactful most of your choices are. Literally the most important choice in the whole game is whether or not Connor shoots Markus at the end, which we don't even get to see the results of. But I think the worst part of this game, though, may be the story, and it's because every single aspect of it is inspired by something else. Oh wow, I wonder who that's supposed to be. It is so unoriginal. This whole idea, lost my job to androids. Yeah, that's ahead of its time and a bit relevant to today, but that's been a plot point since Willy Wonka. The refuge that evolves into android freedom is called Jericho, the same name as the gateway city to the Promised Land in the Old Testament. Slotco is essentially a PG-13 version of Sid from Toy Story with how he takes apart and mishmashes androids, and is supposed to be a sketchy guy that seems nice and promises sanctuary but is off-putting and is actually dangerous, just like David from The Last of Us. Except the reason you don't trust him isn't because of any quality of acting or writing, it's just based off of obvious music cues. Some androids want to coexist with humans while others want to wipe them out entirely, while also serving as an allegory for people facing oppression? Professor X and Magneto. Even the stupid "no androids allowed" sign at the bar. Where have I seen that before?
We don't serve their kind here.
At the very end, the androids, in the face of adversity, decide to sing a song. And the president's heart grew 3 sizes that day. I know everything is inspired by something else, but this game leans too heavily in its inspirations and as a result doesn't do anything new. I've seen all of this before, and you know what the worst part of this derivation is? How this game uses the Holocaust and domestic violence as well as American slavery and its lasting consequences as a shield from criticism. You can't do that! If you want to write in your story an event as catastrophic as the Holocaust, fine, that's okay. But you can't just take historic tragedies and plug it into your story. I'm gonna make my robots ride in the back of the bus and put them in concentration camps. That's awful! That android camp scene made my stomach turn. Not because I felt horrible for the debatably sentient robots in a fictional piece of work, but because I could not believe David Cage took it that far. That's disgusting! I seriously cannot think of any way it could get any worse than this.
Master's dinner's ready.
Wow. Not only did you exploit the Holocaust and slavery to buy empathy points from the player, not only did you create a domestic abuse QuickTime event, but in that QTE, you made me escape by shaking my controller like I'm playing Donkey Kong Country Returns. Apart from how gross this story is though, it also just has some fundamental flaws with it. Like how they put such an emphasis on RA9 throughout the game, but in my playthrough, I never learned who or what it is. Neither did anyone else, by the way. There is no answer to what RA9 is. No one knows. There is no path you can take in this story to find out. Just like Tentacle Head, they threw it in to try and make the story seem more interesting with no intent on developing that story beat. And in this case, it's so the robots can have religion. It's riddled with plot holes too, like how Kara's plot would be completely irrelevant if she just dropped Kara off at a fire department or police station, and how they somehow scrap Markus for parts, but don't have any desire to take the parts of him that are so advanced they can create life. Both of these plot lines are so rushed to the point that Kara, despite seeing an advertisement for an Alice bot, never realizes Alice is a robot because she, and I quote, did not want to see it. Connor and Hank's investigation is the only interesting plot, mainly because it's the only plot that's not morally predetermined in any direction and actually challenges the idea of androids living among and alongside us. Markus's plot is very morally black and white, Kara's adds some gray with the line she's willing to cross to protect Alice, and Connor's story is practically Technicolor and uses the entire light prism, especially with how the police work muddies up the morality. I honestly wish they would have just completely scrapped Kara and Markus's plots and just made an 8-hour police thriller about Connor and Hank navigating this android crisis. Although, I should be careful what I wish for. We all know what happened last time David Cage made a crime thriller. Another huge reason I prefer Connor's story is because it is the only one with characters. That may sound idiotic, most things out of my mouth are, but let me explain. This isn't a character, this isn't a character, this isn't a character, this isn't a character, this certainly isn't a character, and none of these people are characters. These are all completely interchangeable puppets with absolutely no personality of their own. You cannot say that Detroit would be any different if Josh was the mean one and North was the nice one. And I don't even know if that's right. I don't remember which one's which because they're all so bland. They don't have any personalities besides serving as the angel and devil on Markus's shoulders. Almost every character in these plot lines only serve as a conduit to redirect the story back on track. And I really emphasize Carl here because we don't spend enough time with him to care when he keels over, and he only serves two purposes: to be Markus's Thomas and Martha Wayne, and for David Cage to say, oh, only brilliant artists like Carl and myself truly understand androids. And yeah, most people in Connor's story are blank slates too, Connor included, but Hank certainly isn't. And by being his partner and bouncing off his robotic naivety, Hank sort of elevates Connor to his level, creating a sort of Harvey Bullock-Jim Gordon dynamic. It's like they're wandering through a vast desert that stretches out as far as the eye can see, with each grain of sand being yet another interchangeable, exactly similar character, and in the middle, they found a diamond in Clancy Brown. Too bad they grinded that diamond into powder and scattered it to the wind. He has this generic feeling backstory that's the cause of his hatred for androids and that they use to develop his character into an understanding of androids. Except instead of an arcing development, it feels more like a pivot because they choose to throw all of this in at the very end, and not when he's hammered drunk, vulnerable, and suicidal. The ball was on the tee, guys. But now we're on to what might be my least favorite part of this game besides its abysmal technical performance, and that is the basic premise of this game: the androids themselves. I just cannot buy that these androids have sentience. And you might be thinking that it would be easier to suspend my disbelief with Detroit than almost any other story right now, with how worried people are over a total AI uprising or replacement. And that makes sense, I understand. I also convinced my Snapchat AI to give me instructions on how to eat glass, and given the fact this game takes place in 2038, only 20 years after the game released, I just cannot believe that robots could be capable of obtaining sentience. Kamsky himself pretty blatantly explains that Android deviance is just faulty programming, but regardless, they still try their hardest to convince you by putting them through emotional and morally complex situations which their programming is probably just mimicking. Just because they look human and can evoke emotion out of you doesn't mean they're real. For example, I still can't watch Dumbo because that stupid song makes me cry every time, and that movie is missing an entire dimension. And they really try to make you feel for these androids. Like how they try to buy cheap sympathy points by using a kid android, which, by the way, doesn't even make any sense. If that child robot is a deviant, it should be just as mature as the adult models, meaning we shouldn't feel any more sympathy for it than we do for any of the other deviants. And if it isn't, and that kid robot deviant genuinely has the mental maturity of a kid, then it was just acting the way it was programmed to and doesn't actually have a personality or consciousness of its own. Instead of starting from the idea that androids are sentient, they should have made the answer dependent on your choices and had the endings fall into one of 4 categories: sentient good endings, sentient bad endings, programmed good endings, and programmed bad endings. That way, the story you experience lines up with your beliefs on the possibility of AI gaining sentience. But you know what irritates me the most out of this whole unbelievably flawed game? It's not just the questions they ask themselves. It's the fact that they would even ask them in the first place. It feels like David Cage is very egotistical about the human race while also thinking incredibly little of us. Like, humans are so smart that we could artificially create life, but we're so low and insignificant that our souls can be replicated and mass-produced. I cannot believe David Cage, a storyteller and artist, but more importantly, someone trying to express themselves and their ideas, would put a robot painting in his game. Have you seen AI art? Look at this! The idea that David Cage and Detroit are pushing, that art can be replicated and produced by a machine, is antithetical to art itself. I can definitely see why this is a Goober game. It's fine at face value, but when you take a magnifying glass to it, you realize it's technically artificial intelligence in the strictest definition of the phrase, because it is not nearly as smart as it thinks it is. Not to sound like I'm on a high horse, but if you like this game, that's fine, but if I were you, I'd look into what inspired this game before you start glazing it. I'm giving Detroit Become Human a 3 out of 10, and I do not think it deserves to be a Goober game. It's about as subtle as a nail in the eyeball, and you don't have to be morally ambiguous. You can be on the nose and obvious in either direction, like Wolfenstein or Helldivers, but at least those games are fun and don't just consist of walking around, picking stuff up, and doing fighting game inputs. Even Supermassive found a way to make that gameplay fun. Everyone has thought about what they'd do in a horror movie, and they capitalized on that by making choice-based horror games, instead of just asking, hey, you know racism? What if that happened again?